Okay, thank you. And thank you for two very, very interesting introductions. I told you there was going to be some good news as well, and the good news is that we'll have a bit more time for questions and comments from the audience. So just give me a little hint, and I'll put you on the list, and we'll pass the microphone around. Pardon? Yes. But of course, we'll have to comment on each other here as well. And I was going to ask, I would just want to start off with a question for both of you, since we touched upon this. Professor Klausen, it seems to me that what you're advocating is not really judicial, more liberal judicial free speech law in Denmark, for example. This seems more, you seem more to advocate sort of a Spartacus moment, or where people say, you all remember from the movie when they start saying, I'm Spartacus, I'm Spartacus, I'm Spartacus. So is that correct? Is that the correct impression? And my second question would be, what do you think this leads to in practice? Do you think it leads to more dialogue, better understanding, more integration, or could it lead to something else? And I'd like to pass the word to Senator Badinter after you've answered.
No, I do not think the Danes already tried the Spartacus movement, and it went terribly wrong. The republication movement became a demonstration, was misperceived in the Muslim world as another example of how the newspapers in the West really are not just interested in balanced and careful coverage, but rather in provocation. The moment, I actually did not think that the republication back in the day was a good thing, because it just it turned the newspapers into part of the story rather and actors, and rather than in the position of actually covering the news. I would say substitute. So it's nor do I. So and you're correct. I'm not pleading really for any changes to law, no more free speech. But I'm trying to point out that in practice, without any laws actually having changed, practice is very different today than what it has been. And I didn't even mention other well-known examples of corporate change of policy and self-censorship, namely all the museums that are not showing the illustrated manuscripts anymore. Even Bibliothèque Nationale, which has one of the best collections of illustrated manuscripts, are not showing them anymore. So the only, in recent, there have been the Free Gallery in Washington, D.C. has showed illustrated manuscript. The British Library has had an excellent exhibition where they put it up, where they have not actually experienced any problems at all. No, so my argument is, rather than anticipating trouble, don't withdraw and don't self-censor until you have direct evidence of a serious risk. So I'm arguing for a different discussion and recognition of the extent to which self-censorship has become the lesson of the cartoons, and that this bland statement that you now see in all the newspapers that Muslims don't tolerate depiction of Muhammad is actually a false summary of history.
Senator Badinter, if you also want to comment on Professor Klausen's speech, but I would also like
on the question of the cartoons.
But I'd also like to ask you a question that you can answer afterwards, which is for some in the Muslim community, the French burqa ban is also, we know, considered maybe not an insult, but at least anti-Muslim. It's considered a different set of rules after Muslims became a dominant position. So what do you think that leads to in practice, Senator?
Insofar as the cartoon is concerned, I can tell you that in France, the matter was brought before justice by Association of Defense of Human Rights, ici le MRAP, who said that it was an insult to the Muslim communities, and therefore it fell under the law which protects any community versus defamation, etc. And the answer of the court was they were not too keen about the cartoons, but they said, considering freedom of speech, which is a fundamental right since 1789, considering also the tradition of cartoons in France, and especially against the church, during 2 centuries, there is no reason why, in this case, we should sentence the author of the cartoons. And off it was, finished. So that's to show what's the exact situation. Now, about the reactions to the burqa. There have been very few reactions, I mean, very few sentences to the fine I mentioned. It made more, I would say it made more noise abroad than it did in France. In fact, I think that the burqa situation has been understood. It has taken a long, long time before we decided to make a law. And once the law was discussed in Parliament, it appeared that the fundamental reason of the law was not at all religious. It's the question of women's dignity. It's the question of women's equality of rights. May I mention you that the burqa is the uniform that women had to wear where? In Afghanistan. Under which regime? The Taliban regime. And believe that once the NATO soldiers will have left Afghanistan, all women will have to wear the burqa in the public field. So there's a time when you must know who you are. When I go to a mosque, I take away my shoes. When I go to a church, I take away my hat. When I go to the synagogue, I wear a hat. One must also respect the fundamental lines of values of the civilization in which he is. If a European woman goes to Saudi Arabia, she will certainly have to wear the niqab, if not the burqa. She knows it, and she will do it. But why do we accept in our public space such phantom? Because in Afghanistan, the worst of the most fanatic decided that this is the way women should be dressed in their country. Let's be simple about that. You can walk perfectly dressed with the veil in the French streets. Why do you have to bring the burqa? And furthermore, in the few cases we had, most of the women who wore the burqa were of French origin, usually raised up in Catholic Church and then becoming Muslims. C'est le zèle des néo-convertis. No. We must know who we are and what are our fundamentals. This has nothing to do with prejudice against the Muslims or the Muslim religion. Nothing. But we cannot admit this proclamation of inequality between women and men in the French society. We cannot. That's all. It was my position in Parliament, I must say. The socialist group, I was a member, I'm no more a senator, I was a member of the socialist group, said neutrality. I said you cannot be neutral. You have to make a choice. So I should not abstain from the vote, and I said just what I did. And I must say, many of my colleagues, socialists, followed that opinion and decided they would vote for the prohibition of burqa in the public street.
So it's correct to say that you don't view it as a freedom of speech matter or as a religious freedom matter. You view it simply as a society's right, so to say, to regulate what is considered an oppressive garment for a woman.
It's any society must keep strongly its own values, and I would say the values that we share with all the Europeans. And among these values, nowadays, it was not always the case in our history, the equality between, real equality, between men and women is fundamental. We cannot admit that. That's
Okay. There's a woman somewhere in the middle here. I don't know her name, but she was the first one to have a question. Yeah, there we go.
Thank you very much. My name still is Ingvild Plesner. I'm still from the Norwegian Center for Human Rights. Thank you very much. I would like to ask a question, since our question now is what to do. If our representative from France suggests by his statement that the French model of secularism or laïcité is a good model for other countries as well, or rather if you're defending it as a good model in France, because as you referred to, the French history makes it understandable why you're so afraid of religious oppression, specifically from the dominant church, the Catholic Church. Now, your current model is particularly affecting a minority, which makes the context different from Turkey, for instance, where there is a Muslim majority. So in the Sahin case, as you referred to, from the European Court in Strasbourg, it's related to the Turkish context, maybe, where with a majority Muslim population. Still, as Jytte Klausen referred to, maybe we need more evidence of an imminent threat than the court in Strasbourg managed to prove in the Sahin case. There was no evidence of a threat to public order, even in the Sahin case, so it has been severely criticized by international lawyers for that respect. But still, this was a side comment. If your suggestion is that the French model of secularism, or laïcité, is a good suggestion, I would then ask you if your interpretation of it, do you think it's the only French interpretation? Because as I think I recall, when I was at the Sorbonne, Jean Bobéreau, who was a part of the Stasi Commission, he suggested, and he was my supervisor, so he suggested a distinction between strict, laïcité stricte and laïcité ouverte, which has been also adopted by Charles Taylor in his idea on secularism, open and strict secularism. And I think it makes sense then to discuss various different French conceptions of secularism, the more open one opposing the one that you suggest, where neutrality, which was the topic of my PhD, neutrality doesn't have to mean that religion has no room in the public sphere or in the public institutions like the school. It could mean that the state is obliged to treat equally and prevent against not only direct but also indirect discrimination in the legal sense of the term, which would mean that there had to be compelling reasons, to use a concept from the US Supreme Court, there has to be compelling reasons if you would allow a law which appears to be neutral, like the French law from 2004, which in practice strikes mainly a certain group, in this case mainly Muslim women, girls, then you have to have compelling reasons. A secular state could mean that the state officials should not express their religious positions, but that the individuals, the children at least, when entering a public institution, could be allowed to express their religious affiliation. So I'm just questioning if your model of secularism is the only French one, and if you suggest that we should adopt it as well.
Thank you for the conference. Now, insofar as the interpretation is concerned, I don't think la laïcité calls for an adjective. Le président sortant, M. Sarkozy, used to speak about modern laïcité, ou laïcité ouverte, ou laïcité positive. I will stick only to the word laïcité, secularism. It's very clear. Even if you refuse to hear what I say, I see that Professor Gautreaux here as a good disciple, and if the opportunity is granted to me, I shall let him know that he has strong pro-Gautreaux opinion in here, Oslo. Now, if you don't want to listen to what I say, as the public has already spent too much time on it, let's forget. Read Gautreaux, think of laïcité ouverte, which I don't think does exist. And for the remaining, let's stick to the principle. La laïcité est double, it's double. A, it allows you all the religious practices or opinion practices that you want. It's freedom of thinking and expression too. Neutrality of the state means that the state will not, as it was after all, you're an exemplary democracy. I said it took you up to 2011 to suppress the reference to a religion d'État. This has nothing to do with laïcité. There is no privileged religion. There are no special rights for religion. There are no recognition of a state religion. And the public sphere, whether it's in the courts, whether it's in the commissariat police, whether it's in the administration, should remain neutral. The Christ was above the head of the judges up to 1905 in the French court. It was taken away. Not that despise for the French Catholic Church, but because it was a sign of religion in the public sphere. As to the girls you mentioned, and I shall conclude on that, it's so dreadful to take away one's kippah for 2 hours and put it. It's so terrible for the girls to have to take the veil instead of showing their beautiful juvenile hair to their condisciples, and preserve the fundamental principle that this is a neutral space. L'école, among all the places, has made the French Republic. And that's why we are so keen about it. It's l'école. I'm a pure product of that école.
Okay. Next round, just a quick comment. But would you say that the French version of secular neutrality is the only version, or the only valid version?
No. In this field, I mentioned why, because of history, France has taken so much importance on the problem of secularism, because we got to get rid of the major influence of the Catholic Church on the French society. It was really a vision, a political vision, and we all agree to that. 2, because it makes easier what is one of the characteristics of the French society. The French society is one of the most mixed society in the whole of Europe. You must know that in France, we all, not me, I have more than that, but tous les Français considèrent qu'il y a au moins un de leurs grands-parents who is a foreigner, who comes from abroad. It's a very, very mixed up society. It has nothing to do with the Ancien Régime, it's gone. It has been, how would you say, fed by generation of immigrants. I mentioned them one after the other, and there is no difference, not at all because of the school between us, whether we come from here or from there. Voilà pourquoi c'est si important. But each nation follows its ways. In the European Union, the principle is clear. The recipes, pour maintenir la liberté de conscience et la liberté religieuse, the recipe is open to the various nations under the control, of course, of the Cour européenne des droits de l'homme for the whole of the Council of Europe, not only the European Union. C'est clair.
Mr. Gula.
Il y a bien des voix sous ça.
Monsieur, does it bother you or harm you when you pass a school to see the young girls with the hijab? Is that an insult to you? Does it harm you? Why can't you live with those school children wearing the hijab as you pass the playground of the school? I mean, if you say it's not terrible for them to take it off, why is it terrible for you to watch it? It doesn't make any sense.
Merci.
There is a big difference. between wearing a hijab as an expression of your religious affiliation and covering your face as an expression of your religious affiliation. Covering your hair does not impair your communication with your fellow students or with the teachers. The niqab will prevent that communication. It could also, as you said, be a security risk. But we're talking about what people are doing voluntarily. And if they want to walk down the Champs-Élysées with a niqab, they should be allowed to do so. Your concept of neutrality is not neutrality. It is state hostility towards religion. You could say that the officials of the state should be neutral, but the state requires of its citizens certain acts. And when the state, in addition to requiring parents to send their children to school, also say you cannot show your religious affiliation, you are infringing on freedom of religion, freedom of expression, personal freedom even. So the French hostility towards religion, which came about towards Islam in particular, is not a neutral opposition to a secular society. It is a position marking against Islam, which is very unfortunate. It had the consequence that Sikhs also would have to remove their turbans and Jews the kippah. But finally, you said it is important to defend values, and you should do so vehemently. And you mentioned then freedom for women, equality for women.
I think we have to keep the comments a bit shorter. I'm sorry.
I'm just asking a final question.
So,
when did women in your secular laïcité society get the right to vote?
Okay, I'm sorry, we have to have one more question from, and I beg you, please.
I shall just answer in 2 words. Your act of accusation was provocative. May I remind you that it's not only the veil, but the kippah and the cross. The idea of neutrality of the states towards religion in the public school, obviously you don't understand it.
Okay.
Désolé.
Okay, Mr. Belague, am I pronouncing it right? Beleg, I'm sorry. Mr. Beleg, please.
Thank you very much. In this, the final session, there's inevitably a valedictory air, and we cast our minds back over the course of the conference, which has been really splendid. There's just 1 or 2 comments that I'd like to make about the general thrust and tone. There's been a lot of comment about values, core values, and then perhaps a second tier of values that are not core values, maybe they're values taking a certain form. And it is understood that these core values cannot be compromised. Perhaps one could discuss them, but it would be implicit in that discussion that the person you were talking about them to, the incomer, would eventually be convinced by their rightness. The various forms can then be open to discussion. It seems to me that implicit in this sort of formulation is the idea that those incomers, particularly Muslim incomers, because we're talking primarily about them, are in some way either hostile to those values or their belief systems and cultures are inimical to them. If we cast our minds back to the society that was created with the Enlightenment, and we think of the things that we justly regard as the achievements of our society, and we ask whether these things exist in Islam, in Hinduism, in Buddhism. For example, the sanctity of life, the right to dignity for every human being, and above all in our democracies, the principle of consultation as a basis for taking decisions. Do they exist or not? Well, I can say that every belief system that I've ever looked at has contained ample provision for all of these. Now, they coexist with other things, things that may be less acceptable, things that may rub up against these principles, and there is always going to be a contradiction and a conflict. And we find this conflict coming to the fore sometimes with our immigrant communities. I would like to make a recommendation. And that is that we look at our immigrant communities not as the objects of our attempts to convince them to be a certain way, but as interlocutors in a dialogue. It is not good enough, and it certainly won't help France, to look at the migrant communities as people who need to be convinced of the rightness of the French way. The French way will inevitably change, as will the British way, as will the Norwegian way, because that is the nature of absorption. You cannot absorb and stay the same. So what I would like to do is propose that rather than tell migrants how they should behave, we ask them how they think we are behaving, whether they think that we are doing things that they can teach us. It is important for every group to be, this whole idea of dignity rests precisely on this, and I'm just going to end with one example. A few individuals in America, in the Mississippi Delta, are currently engaged on a project with Iranian health officials from Shiraz University. These two countries don't have diplomatic relations. They are caught in decades of enmity. But what the Mississippi Delta medical officials did was to find that around Shiraz there is a model of medical provision that they could learn something from. And the way that they approached the Iranians was to say, we need your help, and we think that you can teach us something. And this was so jaw-droppingly extraordinary for the Iranians that they immediately agreed. And they said, this is the first time that any Westerner has ever said that we can learn from you. And I think this is something that we ought to take away from this conference. The only small, slight disappointment that I have is that there are not more representatives of our incoming communities here to give their point of view. I think we have things to learn from them, just as they from us.
Okay. Thank you, and thank you for 3 very good, well, questions, comments. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, and I'd love to have another hour. I'd love to discuss more of what the last point that was brought up. But we have to have some very quick closing remarks before we give the floor to Professor Garton-Ash. So, Professor Klausen, if you will.
Yeah, I think that it is true that there are some core values and some not so core values, and one of the challenges is to work exactly the balance between what is a really fundamental value. The security of the person, free speech that doesn't conflict with the security, equal opportunity and non-discrimination, and I think that it is clearly the case that different countries, Western European countries, have different interpretations of what these core values mean and how they should be implemented, and countries have, sovereign states, have every right to make those values stick. The issue that really is a difficult one is how do we act without causing unintended consequences on some of these issues. It's not clear, for instance, for the Norwegians who are deeply committed to gender equality, how you best promote that. And one has to, I think in the spirit of what Professor Appiah said before, one has to recognize that experimentation is required. I am, for instance, myself, in support of banning the burqa, but I think that telling women that they can't wear the headscarf in certain occupations, and if you want to tell a policewoman she can't wear the headscarf, I think that the uniform requirements that might make that okay. But I find that adding to anything that puts a stumbling block in front of a woman for going to work and getting an education is in serious conflict with the basic fundamental commitment to equality. So I would argue that the problem with the French actions is not so much a question of first values, but a question of unintended consequences, which are, I think, also an important liberal principle.
Thank you. Senator Badinter.
We just one more word. Don't think, because time was so short, that the French legal apparatus in this field is only prohibition. We have the most advanced legislation to fight against all forms of discrimination against any group or any person because of its religion, confession, social status, etc., etc. And this can be exerted, these actions, not only by the victims, but by groups which are association of defense of the people who are subject to discrimination that may appease the gentleman who brought these accusations. So there is the positive action. And not only that, but we created a special authority to fight against daily discrimination. Daily discrimination is at work, in the choice of the employee, in public places where, for obvious or not obvious, for racial reasons or for religious reasons, some people are not admitted by the fellow at the entrance, etc., etc. We search to fight against all forms of discrimination. And there you find out what I mentioned at the start, equality, equality of all citizens before the law. This is the fundamental principle of our republic. C'est tout.